And he was a very learned man. He corresponded with people across the Atlantic who were in leading political and intellectual circles. But now when I ask the question of my students, what do you think of with Thomas Jefferson? What often comes up first now is he had a mistress who was enslaved, a younger woman named Sally Hemings. So we think about Jefferson in two ways. We think of him as this very prominent man, one of the so-called founding fathers, somebody with an enduring influence on our politics and society. But we also think of him as a slaveholder, and a slaveholder in a sexual relationship that was quite one-sided when one person is owned by the other, literally. So trying to make sense of all of that. So one response is to say, well, he's a hypocrite. He talks about all men are created equal in the start of the Declaration of Independence, and yet he's holding over 200 enslaved people throughout his life. So I certainly understand if somebody wants to stop there, but I think we shouldn't just stop there. Is my preference is that we try to see Jefferson in the context of his time, which is not to let him off the hook, but to see there were a lot of hooks. There were a lot of other people. He was in a society of slaveholders. He thought of himself first and foremost as a Virginian. He always thought of himself as a Virginian more than he thought of himself as an American. And he was vaguely anti-slavery in things he wrote at times, but he never could free himself from slavery, and he could never really think of a way to free Virginia from slavery.
No, that's excellent in terms of, from my perspective, things that I'm trying to express to the students, because myself, it's hard to say, how do you let him off the hook, exactly like you said. So what were some of the issues in terms of, like you mentioned, he vaguely mentioned that slavery was wrong and things like that. What do you believe? What was it that gave him so much trouble trying to step forward and be a leader and maybe end slavery?
Well, Jefferson believed that slavery was bad for slave owners. He felt that young men in particular growing up in the families of those who owned slaves would become tyrants because they see their parents angrily punishing and rebuking enslaved people. And he says, this has terrible consequences for forming the character of young Virginians of the slave-owning class. And he expected the slave-owning class were those who would govern Virginia. So he says, well, what can you do about this then? He knew that slavery was bad for enslaved people, but he focused more on how bad it was for white people. And he said, well, he couldn't imagine that formerly enslaved people, that'd be emancipated, and that they could stay in Virginia as equal citizens. He said, that's just impossible. Again, he's not alone. You couldn't find a single white Virginian on the public record of that generation who would say that free Black people and free white people could coexist in very large numbers. They just didn't believe it was possible. They felt there would be a race war that would be just ultimately destructive and genocidal for one of the races. And they didn't want to risk that. Okay, now, first of all, let's just say there's no evidence that would have happened. There were free Black people in Virginia, and they didn't kill white people hardly ever. It's much more common for white people to kill other white people, to murder them. Almost never does a free Black kill a white person in Virginia. And yet there's this fantasy out there. It's a pervasive, powerful fantasy that's just repeated so often, and people just think it's absolutely true. You can't question it. And Jefferson shares in it. So he persuaded himself, and again, he's not alone. The other leaders of Virginia, almost all of them said, if we can emancipate slaves, we have to deport them. They have to leave Virginia. And it's unlikely that the northern states would be willing to take in hundreds of thousands of freed Virginia slaves. So that locks Virginians into thinking if they do want to emancipate, then they're going to have to pay the further very large cost to ship thousands of people across the Atlantic Ocean in ships back to Africa. Now, when I say back to Africa, almost very, very few of the people, Black people living in Virginia, had been born in Africa by this generation. Their grandparents may have been born there, or their great-grandparents, but they'd been brought over in the 1720s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And after that, there's not that much importation into Virginia from Africa. Now, yes, going into South Carolina and Georgia, there are a lot still going, but not into Virginia. So the whole notion that people who'd grown up in Virginia would want to go back to Africa, go to Africa, I should say, not back to, free Black people didn't want to go. Very few of them would agree to go. What they wanted was to stay in Virginia or stay in some other American state and be treated as equal citizens. And the Virginians are just ruling that out, the white Virginians, including Jefferson. So Jefferson does write at a couple of points in his career saying, I really think we should have a program of gradual emancipation in which the owners will be compensated as if human beings were property, but they'll all have to leave Virginia. And it's to be frank, it's nonsensical. There's no way Virginians are going to give up 40% of their population who are essential to their economy. They've been exploiting them, and they built their economy and their whole social structure on this population of exploited people. So they're not going to give them up. There's no compensation that would persuade most masters to do that. And then are Virginians going to tax themselves for the immense cost of sending thousands of people to Africa? Virginians were hardly willing to tax themselves to do anything at that time. So it's kind of mind-boggling that you would craft a framework like that and act as if it's a reasonable proposition.
No, that makes total sense. And it's like, to hear that, it sounds, compared to today's times, it sounds crazy to even think that. But again, it's hard for anyone to compare today to back in those times, how different things were. And again, that's one of the complexities with Jefferson, and that I have trouble myself getting across to the students, is because, again, like you said right in the beginning, there's, the founding father, religious freedom, all of these things that we give him credit for. But at the same time, it always makes you ask, is he that true hypocrite? And getting back to something else you touched on, Abraham Lincoln, a lot of people don't know, again, about his colonizing plan, and so that kind of ties into that, the thoughts of not just in Virginia, but in other places as well. So that's mind blowing. When Jefferson went to France, did Sally Hemings have opportunities to stay away, but then stay with him? She chose to stay with him, I should say.
Well, the best understanding and the best book on this is Annette Gordon Reed's book, The Hemingses of Monticello. And there was a tradition in the Hemings family that is recorded by her son and Jefferson's son, Madison Hemings, in a memoir that he wrote in the 1870s, that Sally Hemings and her brother James were both in Paris in the staff serving Thomas Jefferson and his daughters who were with him. Slavery was legal in the French Empire, places like Martinique or Guadeloupe, islands in the West Indies, but it wasn't legal within France. So the Hemings, brother and sister, James and Sally, could have stayed in France, and they would have been free. So Jefferson, according to the Hemings family tradition, negotiated with Jefferson and said, if I come back I will remain your partner, but you must commit that our children will be freed. Now, on the one hand, we sort of think, well, wouldn't Jefferson want to free people who were his own children anyway? But there are a lot of cases of white Virginians who have sexual relations with enslaved women who then sell the children. And Sally Hemings does not want that to happen. So apparently the understanding was reached, and all of the children that survive infancy will end up being freed. Generally, either Jefferson looks the other way when they run away, or they're just freed through Jefferson's own actions. But they generally then have to leave Virginia, because state law in Virginia after 1806 was that if you're freed, you got to leave the state of Virginia. But the people governing Virginia in 1806 wanted to stop the growth of the free Black population in that state.
Okay. Question also, because I think you've answered more like already that quickly. You hit kind of the nail on the head. Would you mind answering a question about Andrew Jackson? Is that okay?
No, I don't mind.
Okay. So Andrew Jackson's another complicated figure. He gets credit, obviously for extending democracy, which is, generally just for white males. But a lot of people are always interested in his relationship with Daniel Boone, et cetera. Is there anything that you could share that might be interesting to some high school kids about that?
Well, I don't think he had any relationship with Daniel Boone, who was an earlier generation and up in Kentucky and then Missouri. He had more of a relationship with Davy Crockett.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's all right.
That's my miss. That's
oh, that's
trying
all right.
to make sure I'm saving everything here. And
they both apparently wore coonskin caps, so we tend to confuse them.
Stereotyping.
But Jackson becomes a symbol for the so-called democratization of America in the early 19th century. And what do we mean by that? Because sometimes we often say, well, the U.S. Constitution and the founding fathers of that generation established a democracy. And I would say not really. They established a republic. And that republic has a powerful democratic component to it. But the founding fathers, through a variety of institutional mechanisms, like the U.S. Supreme Court, or a Senate in which every state, no matter how large or small, has 2 senators, in other words, the same power, those are undemocratic features. And they're not in there by accident in the Constitution. They're in there on purpose, because the founding fathers weren't entirely comfortable with what they would call a pure democracy. Now, over time, our system has evolved somewhat in a more democratic direction. And some of those changes happened, or many of those changes, I should say, happened at the state level rather than the federal level. And there was a whole spate of state constitutions adopted, especially during the 1820s, which moved state governments in a more democratic direction, in that they eliminated, in most of these new state constitutions, they eliminated a property requirement to vote. So it wasn't enough that you were just 21 years old. You had to be male, you had to be free, and you had to own some property, enough to support a family. So that ruled out a pretty substantial number of white people, including white men. So state constitutions, during the 1820s, when they're rewritten, mostly go toward a model of saying, if you pay any kind of tax or you serve in the militia, which almost all able-bodied younger men did, if you do one of those 2 things, you get to vote. So it substantially broadened the electorate. But let's be clear, didn't include women, didn't include enslaved people. So it's a partial democratization. And because it's happening about the same time that Andrew Jackson is becoming the most popular politician in America, he becomes a symbol of it. And he's probably a beneficiary of that expanded electorate. But Jackson really didn't do anything himself to contribute to this partial widening of the electorate. It's not like he's pushing that as his big issue. And in fact, he's kind of a conservative man on that particular issue. But he's the beneficiary of this wider electorate because this is a male electorate. And Jackson is, for his time, kind of the consummate masculine figure. It's a time where if you have a track record of waging war on Indians and killing a large number of them, that makes you a hero. Jackson is number one in America. And so he appeals to a broad male electorate that what they're looking for is a tough guy. Tough guy will stand up to Britain, who will keep enslaved people under control, and who will continue to fight Indians and take their lands away from them to benefit American white settlers. That's what Jackson ultimately is about in the eyes of the voters who elect him to the presidency.
Well, I can't thank you enough. And to be honest, like, you answered everything I had just that quick. And so I don't need to take up any more of your time. I can't, thank you enough for that. I do have one thing though. Do you remember Don Worcester?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so I did interview him too, because one of his book on the Dust Bowl was very influential for me as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great book.
In speaking, he said that he had you as a student. He spoke very highly of you.
Well, he's misremembering just a little bit because he did go to Brandeis, but he went there after I had left.
Oh, okay. He must then,
Right.
yeah, because
Yeah,
he said,
I mean, he and I have encountered each other at conferences, and
okay.
But if he wants to claim me as a student, hallelujah, because he's a great guy, great historian.
What happened? What brought it up just really fast is that parts of, for example, in your book, Colonies, American Colonies, like there's some things that, that in his book, Dust Bowl, they're not exactly the same, but there's, in the ways that people treated the earth and, in both. And he made it was a really funny comment. He said, well, I don't think Mr. Taylor would agree with me on certain things. And I said, well, I don't know, but some of the things that y'all had a lot in common in what you were in, from my interpretation, from what I read. So I thought that was really cool. And he was such a nice guy too.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry to take up your time, but thank you.
Oh, you don't need to apologize. It's been good talking to you, Chad. And, I wish you all the best. And
thank you. And I can't wait to read your new book.
Okay. Thank you. Now.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right. You too.